I think we're on now, David.
You're live. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I didn't get any cues, so I'm going to imitate Tamara and say good morning, everybody.
And I'm just going to laugh. I saw the countdown. 1, 2, 3.
It's David and Nina's show today, and we're going to talk about higher education and race and segregation in higher education and what kind of implications that's had over the years. This was partly based on a story I read. I think it was in the AJC, in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, about the story of I think her name is Myra Elliott, and 2 other Black women who integrated Georgia State University in 1959, except that they were not allowed to join the student body. And the state legislature fought tooth and nail with all sorts of ways to keep them out of Georgia State. So it wasn't for another 10 years before there were Black students at Georgia State. I don't know if people know this, but Georgia State was a whites-only institution for quite a while from its founding in the late 40s or early 50s until the late 60s. So anyway, on top of that, we wanted to talk about Nina's experience going to an HBCU, historically Black college and university, Tennessee State University, where she had a minority scholarship. Is that right?
Yes, that's what I had.
So, that in itself is very interesting because it was an attempt to integrate the schools, the higher education system in Nashville, right?
Right. So you want me to say a little about that?
Yeah.
It came up because David was talking about this topic of desegregation at the college and university level. And when I lived in Nashville in the mid-70s, I went to school at Tennessee State University, which is a state school, but it was an historically Black college. So I was able to go on a minority scholarship because I was a white person going to a predominantly Black university. I knew while I was there that there was some kind of lawsuit that was going on with that, because at the same time that Tennessee State University existed there in Nashville, there was in downtown Nashville a satellite campus of the University of Tennessee. So it was called UT Nashville. The main campus is in Knoxville. And that's where all the white students went. And what happened with all of this was that having this kind of arrangement basically meant that it was supposed to be, I guess, a kind of separate but equal system. And functionally, what occurred over time was that funding, I think both federal and state, went primarily to UT Nashville's campus, which was the predominantly, or it was the white university. And that took money away from Tennessee State, which, really struggled. It was interesting to read this history as I was preparing to talk with David today, because I had felt sometimes in the last few years like maybe I shouldn't have gotten that scholarship to go to Tennessee State because, primarily what was intended for a minority scholarship was for people who are in a minority in the larger world to be able to go to school. But then in reading the history, I realized that I was doing exactly what Tennessee State hoped that white people would do to help integrate the system. And that made me feel a little better about accepting the minority scholarship, for one thing. But I also ended up reading that it took nearly 38 years to settle this, including, I believe, a case that went to the Supreme Court about how this desegregation could happen in Nashville fairly, so that Tennessee State could both retain some of that sense of its identity as an historically Black college and university, and at the same time be fully integrated and receive the funding that it deserved as an institution that was desegregating. So that's all I'm going to say about that.
Well, you could say more about your
Okay.
own experience there.
If you want, I will. It was a great experience.
Yeah, that would be really nice for people to hear, I think.
Okay. Well, you want me to take just another minute or two to say about that?
Take as much time as you want, Nina.
Okay. It was a really wonderful experience for me. I felt pretty well accepted on campus. I often was either the only white person in a class, or I was one of sometimes two white people in classes. And what this did for me was give me at least a small scale feeling for what it's like to be a minority. I mean, I know that I went home to a predominantly white neighborhood when I lived in Nashville, but within the confines of the university, I was in a minority. And what struck me, even at the time, because I was 18 or 19 years old, was that I felt that I was being better accepted as a white person among a whole lot of Black people than I felt like would ever be the case, at least at that time, with the reverse situation, that I didn't think a single Black person would be accepted quite as comfortably. I had some professors that I really liked a lot. There was a man, Dr. Goins, that taught music appreciation. That's one of the things that I took there, and I loved Dr. Goins' class. I was in the art department there. I had an experience on campus that is hard for me to describe, but it was a sense of sort of waking up in the world, so that I always associate that with Tennessee State. I had various friends. There was, I don't know if it's okay to mention names or not, but there was a guy that was a fellow art student named David Solomon, and he was getting his degree to kind of augment, I think it was an associate degree he had in graphic arts. And, you know, he and his girlfriend invited me over to, you know, a cookout, and just, I don't know, there were just a lot of really good experiences. There was another young woman that I remember, she was from Atlanta, and I drove her down to Atlanta and back with me since I would come home periodically. And the only, you know, it meant that I went from the predominantly white side of town to the Black side of town, which was an interesting experience because I was usually riding public transportation. And so there was a point downtown where everything would reverse, that I was on a bus with all white people, and then all the white people would get off, and it would usually become all Black. And I'm about to say something that is not a negative about Tennessee State, because I never felt unsafe on campus. I never had any kind of problem or anything that was in any way threatening to me. Not that I would expect otherwise, but just since the perception often is among white people that that's dangerous, that the only negative pushback I got about going to school at Tennessee State was from white people. And I remember a couple of people, because I had a part-time job too, there was a white guy, maybe even a couple of them, that thought that I should carry a gun with me on campus.
Yeah.
Because I was somehow at risk or in danger while I was there. And I just, even at my young age, I just thought, this is really weird, because I'm not unsafe in this environment. I don't feel threatened in this environment. And I've got white people telling me I should be afraid.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I think that's a really interesting observation, that that you get this kind of cultural message from other European Americans who are thinking and acting white.
Yeah.
That you know, you are what do you call it? Crossing the boundaries, and they want you to feel threatened by doing that,
Yeah.
by making those kind of boundary crossings, transgressions,
Yeah.
so to speak, and to somehow pull you back in to the white race, within the confines, of the white race. What's your and I mean, I've heard this from many people, that have stories to tell. European Americans who have stories to tell about how they either didn't know that they were supposed to stay within the boundaries, or defied them, and were given the same kind of advice. I mean, the Unitarians, when I lived on Martin Luther King Drive, when I first moved to Atlanta, and was teaching at Kennesaw State at a time when it was practically lily white, and also mainly fundamentalist Christian. I knew that I was safer on Martin Luther King Drive than I was up at Kennesaw State.
Yeah.
But what was interesting was that I was also attending the Unitarian Church here in Atlanta, which is the most liberal, religious denomination that you can find.
Right.
And if and when I mentioned where I lived, I got the same kind of panicked reactions that you were getting.
Yeah.
So even among these very, very liberal whites, there was a sense that that Martin Luther King Drive was this, I don't know, alien territory that was hostile, and that, oh my God, how could you live there? You gotta get out of there. There was some sense that I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah.
So I hear you, and I think that that's really an important point. What about your thoughts about being in a Black culture? Can you is there anything that specifically, not just the idea that you were a minority and that the situation was reversed, but was there's something that you're I mean, the welcoming was certainly, part of what we're, part.
I don't know. It's really hard to say. I just know that I felt comfortable and I felt at home. And I mentioned, for instance, this professor I had, Dr. Goins, because he also directed a choral group from Tennessee State. And maybe this is kind of an answer to your question. There was an evening where that choral group was going to be performing at Vanderbilt. And because I was so fond of Dr. Goins, and because of it being the choral group from Tennessee State, I decided to go to the performance. So I was sitting in the audience, and I suddenly felt acutely aware of the fact that all of the people in the chorus were the Black people, and the audience was white. I mean, it was like I understood that, but it was like at some level I had stopped thinking of myself as white in the same way. And so I was looking at them and I was thinking, well, but they'll see me. They'll know that somebody that is part of the group is here. And then it was like it hit me, no, they won't see me because I look like everybody else. And I've really puzzled over what exactly that meant to me. But the thing that I've concluded is that it was the first time I felt really aware in a different kind of way of being white. I mean, it's not like I didn't know that, but it was like I realized something about my own invisibility because of being white. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
And that was a really significant thing to understand.
Yeah. And I think what you were experiencing maybe was the denormalization of your connection with the white race.
Yep, I think so.
That this was not a normal kind of an experience,
right?
To be so completely segregated and assumed to be, in the white race, so to speak. which
And
is
I do feel like I have encountered that a number of times through the rest of my adulthood, where assumptions are made because I look white, because
yeah.
obviously I'm Caucasian,
Mm.
but where people assume a whole range of things about what I think and feel based on that, who are
Yeah.
also white people. And that's always been hard for me to know exactly how to respond to. I'm afraid we're drifting too far away. I mean, I don't mind talking about this. I know you had some things you wanted to talk about today, and I thought they were interesting. So,
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this whole thing with Tennessee State and the fact that you went to Georgia State,
Yep.
later on,
Yep.
really interesting because here you have these two big cities in the South. And in the case of Georgia State, I had always heard that that Georgia State was separate and equal because black students could go to Atlanta University,
Right.
the schools in Atlanta University.
Yeah.
But Atlanta University was a private university, and
Right.
tuition was much, was really an issue. I think for a lot of students, this Myra Elliott had to drop out of Spelman because she couldn't afford it, and she went to
Right.
work. So there's a lot of that, and where she was working in the late 50s was somewhere downtown, very close to Georgia State, and she thought, "Gee, this is perfect. I could take classes in the evening and continue working." And of course, that's exactly what has happened over the last 60 years or so, 50 plus years,
Yeah.
that Georgia State has become a school from being, whites only and fighting, heavily against admitting African Americans to being one of the school, probably a third or more of the student body is African American, and it's probably more than a majority, given immigrants and Latinx folks and Asians. It's probably majority, non-European Americans. So, so we've had a real transformation at Georgia State, and yet there was this long period in which there was my understanding. I mean, this is only a rumor that I've heard, is that during the 60s, applications to Georgia State had to be accompanied by a photo. So, and I've never been able to corroborate or confirm that, but if anybody knows anything about it, who's listening in, please do get in touch with us, because the idea was, and the other part of the story is that there wasn't this kind of resistance to the integration of University of Georgia. The state legislature was, and so I mean, what was the difference? Why was it so important to prevent Black people from being admitted to Georgia State, whereas UGA was which is a quote unquote better school, right? I mean, it's the flagship state university.
Here's what I wonder. Since Georgia State started, I'm sorry, I'm getting echo. How do I eliminate the echo?
I don't know.
Okay. Well, anyway, since Georgia State started out as a business school, and business being a good old boy network, I wonder if that's part of what the resistance was to integrating Georgia State in particular.
Well, I think that's a good point. I'm not hearing an echo from you,
and it's gone now for me too.
Okay, all right.
So
maybe Tamara's back there doing some.
Maybe so. It's surprising how disconcerting that is. It's like, what?
Yeah, believe me, I understand that. Yeah. So
anyway,
I think you're right, and I would say that it's very possible that because the University UGA was kind of an elite school, that they figured there would be kind of an automatic discrimination,
Yeah.
that would take place. And at Georgia State, however, this was a place where working class whites could get, into better, economic status and social status, and so it was seen as a place where, where it was more, there was more of a threat that Black people would be access the university. I mean, Athens was far away. There are many people who have gone to Georgia State who work part-time or full-time, and of course a much larger Black population in Atlanta than anywhere else. So it feels like it was kind of holding the line, both in terms of providing a white privilege for working class whites, and at the same time seeing that Georgia State, if they opened it up, would open the floodgates for African Americans.
So here's a question I have. Since you were talking earlier about the experience I had as a white person in Nashville, where I'm kind of getting pushed to toe the line and, believe that Black people are dangerous when it was not my experience. I wonder if that's a part of what the resistance was about having that working class group of white people encounter Black people if they had begun to integrate the system. Because you've talked about before the fact that working class whites and Black people actually have things in common, strong interests, where they could work together. And that would have created a situation where the two groups might have come together more and found out they did have those things in common.
Yeah. I think you're right. I mean, segregation is preliminary for maintaining, is a necessary, if not sufficient, condition for maintaining the inequality between Blacks and whites, and breaking solidarity between two sections of the working class.
Right.
The more you have people integrated, the more that European Americans begin to see the experience of Black people as being much, much more desperate than their experience, and to kind of get confronted with the injustice of it, and have the possibility of saying this is unjust, this is not right, and acting in solidarity. So it really can erode the white privilege, partly because most European American working people have a kind of an intuitive sense of injustice and justice. Yeah. So, I think that certainly is a strong consideration for why the South remained so segregated for so long.
But I just think this whole topic is so interesting. I may have already said this, because I think a lot of people at this point have been aware of the desegregation and the resistance to it in terms of public elementary and high schools, but hadn't really ever thought about it as kind of a concerted effort in a different way at the college level, which is really, really interesting. And also disgusting.
Yeah, and I was going to mention a few other things. I mean, people know about segregation academies in the South, that were the outgrowth of the massive resistance to school desegregation after Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, and the second decision, which gave the loophole of all deliberate speed, which is the term that was used, which ended up being a permission to delay and slow down the process of integration in the South. But the segregation academies were also, they were private Christian schools that were, there's a new project that's going on to find people who had gone to segregation academies to tell their stories from, of their experience there. And of course, a lot of those schools now are they've either morphed into Christian schools, very, very, many of them fundamentalist Christian, or they have morphed into private, schools, many of which are, not many of which, but private schools that are elite schools, elite private schools, and kind of have hidden their origins, so to speak. So there's a lot of that. But then the other side of it is that all over the country, it seems to me, particularly in the Northeast, there have also been ways in which higher education has been segregated. So, for instance, I taught at Temple University in downtown Philadelphia for a year. As people may know, I was an out of tenure stream academic for many, many years. So I taught at a lot of different schools. And when I was teaching at Temple University, which was a state university, they offered me a position that was at a satellite campus, which was much closer to where I lived, just outside of Philly on the main line. And it was outside of Philadelphia. It was in the White Flight suburbs. And it was huge. It was a really large campus. So the Temple University, in order to keep its enrollments up, had essentially set up a virtually whites-only satellite campus. And I discovered that when I taught at Villanova, for instance, which is out in the main line, which is a Catholic school, not Jesuit, but much more conservative than the Jesuits, that the few Black students who were there called the school Vanilla Nova. So that was another thing. And then I taught at another school up in Massachusetts, part of the Massachusetts State University system, called Westfield State College, which was in the south central part of the state. And the campus was virtually all white. And I realized that a lot of these students were from white suburbs, and their parents were sending them there primarily because they didn't want them to go to school in the city, where they would be unsafe. Right. So the same kind of issues of safety that you're talking about and that I'm talking about Martin Luther King Drive are really, they reinforce the segregation patterns that we're talking about. So I have a feeling that there are many, many state universities and colleges that are white by design, that are set up so that they are outside of urban areas, and they're places where Black people and other people of color are not welcome, or haven't been until very, very recently. And so there's a lot going on there, and at the same time, one of the things that we were talking about is what has happened maybe with this transformation of education and integration of higher education is the abandonment, the financial abandonment of state universities by particularly Republican legislatures, right? So over the last couple of decades, increasingly, in order to go to a state university, which used to be virtually free, that what's happened is that more and more the costs require students and their families to take out loans in order to get a college education. And, by about 10 years ago, the student debt in the country was $1 trillion. Now, within the last 5 years, it's grown from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion.
Yeah.
So we have essentially what we've done is we've privatized higher education. The financial responsibility for higher education has been privatized. It's been dumped onto working class families.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody suffers from that, including the entire economy, because the amount of debt that students have coming out of that graduates have if they graduate, is so large that people can't afford to buy homes. They can't afford to go on to get a master's degree or some other credential that might increase. And increasingly, I've talked about the 9.9%, the right under the 0.1% that's the ruling elite.
Mm-hmm.
This 9.9% is increasingly, those are the people who get to go to the elite private universities. They're the only ones who can afford it.
Right.
And so in spite of the fact that all of these schools like Princeton and Yale and the Ivy Leagues and the other private schools like Emory, or Stanford or University of Chicago,
right.
are very aware of the need to diversify both in terms of race, gender, and class. They can't do it because they can't afford to anymore.
Right.
In spite of their huge endowments. So it's as if the upward mobility, there's a glass ceiling there between the schools where when you graduate, these elite research one universities, you graduate from a place like that, you almost automatically can get a place in a graduate program.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't, you can come out making $100,000 a year because of the connections that the school offers you. And whereas a graduate of Georgia State is certainly not going to be on that kind of trajectory unless they are extremely lucky and well connected, right?
So, and that's something that we talked about a little bit yesterday also, that just from the point of graduation, the trajectory is very different for somebody from Yale versus somebody from a state school, and that has ramifications all through their lives about earning potential, and and that relates to things like Social Security benefits later on, and just a whole series of things.
And also where you end up in the decision-making hierarchy of the country, right?
Yes, that's true too.
Yeah, I mean, you could go to Georgia State Law School, but you're never going to be considered for, or not never, but it's much
It'll
less.
It'll be harder.
Yeah, it'll be harder to get considered, let's say, for a judgeship,
right. Right.
or any of the paths through which a law degree could take you to a high-powered firm, law firm, and becoming a partner, and all of those kind of things. You're just on a even if you get a comparable degree, your trajectory is going to be your life trajectory is going to be sort of flattened. Compared to somebody who goes to Yale Law School, and I mean, there are an awful lot of people African Americans that you can see who've gone to the elite law schools who are real leaders in the so it's if they get in, you can see what kind of for African Americans, if they get in, you could see what kind of a door it opens for them, right?
Uh-huh.
And
Right.
that's most glaring example. But there are plenty of people, European Americans, um, who come from less than the upper middle class, that upper 10% circumstances, who also become very, very prominent in the, if they manage to squeeze in the way that black people do, manage to squeeze into some of these elite places.
Yeah. So one thing I'm thinking about as we're talking this time about this is I'm going to kind of talk about it in terms of my own life, but I'm also thinking this may be connected to how other people experience this too, because I'm not trying to beat up on myself. So understand that. I just know that, I went to school. It took me a long time to get a college degree because I kept having to drop out and work and drop out and work and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've got the college degree, but I've never really had much earning potential. I mean, I've done the best I could. And I think considering everything, I've functioned pretty well. But it's like I could never seem to get through to something else, whatever that something else was. I don't really know. And I've tended to fault myself for that, feeling like I'm kind of a failure or something. But now when I'm talking to you, I'm kind of ending up with the sense that it's almost guaranteed that I wouldn't be able to get much farther than I did.
Mm-hmm.
And that, in fact, the system is kind of set up to ensure that that will happen, that I don't really get very far in it. If unless I do these other things, which I was never going to be able to go to Yale or someplace like that. I could manage a state school. And along with whatever you lose in terms of earning potential and access to power and decision making and all the rest is what it does to you personally when you think that you're doing all the things that you're supposed to do to get ahead and somehow it doesn't work.
Yeah, and I mean, that really resonates with me, Nina, because I got a PhD in history from a flagship university, University of Virginia. But by the time I went to graduate school at UVA, I'd been a blue collar worker for 8 years, so I was older. By the time I finished my degree, I was in my early 30s. And what I did not know, what I did not understand was that I just missed getting several fellowships, for instance. I was like number 2 on a list, something like that. But when you're in the higher education, a vocation, your degree really has a shelf life.
Right.
And once if you're 2 or 3 years out from your degree, they really don't want to hire you because there are so many graduates, with PhDs that they can. And on top of that, why take somebody from UVA when you can get a Princeton graduate? And on top of that, I was a radical, so I was controversial to begin with. And you'd much rather have somebody who was a moderate, so to speak, who wasn't going to be trouble in a department. And also, being older, I was less likely to be malleable, to the department. And then what I discovered, so that this was all things that I was thinking about, and I was doing exactly what you're saying. I mean, I was publishing articles, I was teaching, I was getting all of this teaching experience. And what I began to realize was that it didn't matter. It just didn't matter. And ultimately, what I began to realize, and one of the places was when I was teaching at Georgia State, um, was that the higher education industry itself, the higher education industrial complex,
Right.
if you call it that, like the military industrial complex,
Yes.
had gone through a radical change because the squeezing of the budgets meant that that they didn't want to hire permanent tenure track employees anymore,
Yeah.
because there were so many PhDs that were out there that they could get people to work part-time
Yeah.
for a quarter or a fifth of the salary, with no benefits, no
Right.
retirement and no medical benefits.
Right.
So half the time that I was teaching over the course of 25 years, in which I taught at 25 different schools, you can imagine what that does to make you crazy. And
Yeah.
what I realized was that this was a system, that they had created a system to solve the problem of the squeezing of higher education budgets by state legislatures. And this was not my fault that I didn't get a tenure track job. And in fact, at Georgia State in the late 90s, while I was living on Martin Luther King Drive, there were a bunch of the adjunct faculty, the part-time, faculty that organized at Georgia State.
Huh.
So, and they did some changes at Georgia State. It was very temporary, but so I began to realize that, hey, I am an academic proletarian. I'm an academic worker. I'm not a hotshot, college professor. And that in itself was kind of both liberating and angering at the same time. You understand what I'm saying there. So, and I think that the whole relationship between tenure track people, and these people who are outside of the tenure track, who now are the majority.
Right.
60, 70% of the faculty in this country are not working in permanent jobs.
Right.
They may be full time, but a large number of them are part time. They're working for $3,000 a course.
Yeah.
And they have no job protection. If the course does not get its quota, enrollment quota, they could just tell you, sorry, course has been canceled. So and from one semester to the next, you're completely at the mercy of the whoever in the department is doing the hiring. So you really have no academic freedom, in the sense of being able to speak and teach what you want, because the students protest against you, or you get bad student evaluations, you're gone. So yeah.
Well, I was just kind of wanting to broaden it back out, though, to the topic of race and desegregating at the college level, and thinking about how, because what we're describing is what happened for us as, European Americans, since I know that's a term you kind of prefer. And so difficult as it has been for us to crack, that means that it's been even harder for people of color.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways that this comes out is that the schools that have the heaviest concentration of part-time faculty tend to be those working class schools, and particularly. So it's kind of like an indirect thing that's going on there, but they tend to be the working class schools in inner city areas where there are high concentrations of research of PhDs or people who are ABD, all but dissertation.
Right.
And so there's this workforce that's available from in New York City, from Columbia University, from NYU, and from all of the CUNY Graduate Center, so that all of these people can be used as a kind of a kind of a part-time army of labor,
Right.
to that you could pay very little.
Right.
You don't have any commitment to them whatsoever. And the students that they teach tend to be the working class and people of color students, right?
Right.
And so you see that very clearly and acutely. And on top of that, the other thing I think that's very interesting is the way that this system has operated. It kind of mirrors the racial privilege divide, because if you are in the tenured and tenure track status, your life is very different from a person who is outside of the tenure. It's almost like a mimicking of the racial divide, right? And one of the things that I would argue, because I've been at this for a while, I've been doing things with adjunct organizing for almost 20 years now, is that this really affects the tenure stream. I mean, their wages are lower. Right. Their control over their working conditions has declined over the years. Faculty autonomy is almost non-existent at this point. And
I just want to clarify. So you're saying that the fact that there are all these adjunct professors also has an impact on people who actually have tenure.
Yeah.
So that it's a
privileged group.
Okay, I thought that's what I heard you saying. I just wanted to make sure that's what I was hearing.
Yeah. And I think that there are enormous costs to the privileged group for their lack of solidarity with who are in these precarious positions across the country. I mean, liberal arts faculty make much less than they could, if they were doing something in a private sector with the kind of degrees and education that they have. I mean, these are people who've written books. They're and they've taught. I mean, teaching is, there's a lot of work involved.
Right. Yeah.
Outside of the classroom. So anyway, I think that's a very important consideration, because that's exactly what I'm trying to get at when we're talking about working class schools and the growing debt. I mean, the debt burden now is so enormous that it's really having a deleterious effect on the economy as a whole.
Right.
It's not just so you have all of these dynamics in higher education that that have really hurt the ability not just of African Americans but of working class whites to get a higher, get a degree, get a higher education, and the trade-off is that you're paying off debts for the next 20 years, 30 years. There are people who are in their 60s who are now paying, still haven't finished off paying their college loans.
Yeah. Well, and as the mother of 2 millennials, I certainly hear from them, a kind of, I don't know what it is to call it exactly. They're just aware that there are a bunch of things they thought they were supposed to do as adults that are elusive for them. That home ownership looks impossible at this point, which I know is something you've mentioned is kind of an effect of all of this. And that's certainly one of the ways that the economy gets affected too, the bigger economy. Just that because I have millennial kids and their friends are millennials, I feel aware of that generation and the ways that they've been affected by some of what you're describing here about debt itself. And even because we were talking yesterday, even at a state school, the debt is not trivial at this point. You know, it's more manageable than it is if you go to a private school, but that doesn't mean that it's free because, you know, I was saying to you yesterday, and it may surprise people, it was this low, but when I was in college at Georgia State in the mid 70s, it was $150 for a full load, you know, I think, I don't know, it was either 3 or 5 classes. I can't remember which, but I mean, it was just a very cheap education. And I got a little confused about adjusting for inflation, but I'm pretty sure that what I ended up figuring out was that the tuition, the annual tuition at Georgia State at this point is really about 3 times of what would be the equivalent money of that time, either 3 or 4 times. So that's a pretty significant increase for a state education. And that's the low level of education.
Well, I went to an elite private college. You know, my tuition, and I'm talking, I'm older than you, so I'm talking.
I know.
In the mid '60s, the tuition there was $1,000 for the year.
Yeah.
And I mean, my parents couldn't have afforded that. You know, even though I was an only child, I was single. They just didn't. They were working class people in New York. They couldn't make that kind of payment. I got a scholarship through various means. But, you know, Oberlin's tuition, my school, you know, Oberlin, the tuition now is something like $45,000 a year. And that's just the tuition, you know. And Oberlin is a very, very well-endowed private college. You know, I mean, I think it's got almost $1 billion in endowment.
Yeah.
So anyway, the point that you were making about this, one of the connections that we could make is, isn't it ironic that these millennials are the children of the folks who went out to the suburbs, you know, and kept them white, you know.
That's a good point.
Property values, right? And ended up with these white by design, not only white by design suburbs, but white by design colleges and universities. And their kids can't afford a home.
Right.
I mean, it really is. And I think very much that's connected with the fiduciary or financial abandonment of the state university systems, particularly where the Republicans are in control of state legislatures and have been for a number of decades. It just simply dumps the costs of education, of higher education, onto individuals, and with taking out loans, it also increases their risks. You know, the banks are guaranteed; those loans are guaranteed to for the banks. And college debt, student debt is, if you take out one of those loans, you can't even if you die. I don't know how you get out of it. You can't declare bankruptcy on those debts.
Yeah.
So it becomes a really it's the ironies of racial inequality that yes. It preserves the inequality, preserves the higher status for European Americans, right? But that doesn't mean they aren't being exploited, by the system. And so you end up with people who really can't choose very much about what they're going to do. They just have to get a job, because they've got to pay those. They got to pay, instead of paying a house mortgage, they're paying a mortgage on their degree, in effect.
Yeah. So I feel like what you are often doing, certainly with me in the conversations that we have, is making. I would say it this way: that you're working to make visible what is invisible or is only slightly visible.
Yeah.
That all of these supposed benefits or privileges of being white have these costs, not only to white people, but to the whole culture that affects everybody of whatever racial background you are. And that it's kind of a rigged system where it's set up that only certain people are going to achieve in it, and the rest of us are going to struggle and feel like we're not doing what we were supposed to do somehow or something. I don't know.
And work for the ones who have rigged the system.
Yeah, because I mean, what I'm also hearing, like with even state schools, is that a great deal of money goes into the schools. I'm not sure how they spend their money and what they spend on, but evidently they manage. I mentioned to you yesterday, and also I want to say we got like 3 minutes left here. So if there are some final points, I'll get out of here fast. But there was an article that I had read about a new dorm for Georgia State students that is opening up, that is like a kind of high scale, condo. And I'm not saying that students who live in dorms should live in lousy conditions, but it just seemed odd to me, as someone who went to Georgia State because it was an inexpensive school and it was within what I could afford, and it was considered a commuter college for an older student body, that now they are about to have a high-rise building with what looked to me like pretty nice condominiums in them.
Yeah.
For students to go to. And that's a part of what I assume would sort of feed the system itself, the educational system, in terms of money. Anyway, I don't know.
Well, I think also that what it may mean is that there is a strategic plan to what you might call whiten Georgia State,
Okay.
And make it less and less affordable for people of color, particularly African Americans. I don't know. I mean, it's the other possibility is that they're setting up programs within Georgia State, that are kind of elite programs.
Yeah.
And that will be more likely to attract students who otherwise might go to UGA. Right.
Okay. Yeah.
So there's all of these marketing things that that go on that we're not privy to.
Right. So you've got about 1 minute left. I mean, I see that it's almost noon, so I just am trying to keep you on track.
Well, I think that this is a complicated, story. Higher education is hundreds of billions of dollars of industry, but it certainly has been constructed or reordered or reorganized in a fashion that has made it much more in line with the class structure, and the social control structure in this country, as it has changed over the last 50 years or so, and as a toiler in that system, I can see how it has how the transformations have taken place, because they may be building this a high-rise, what do you call it, high-end, ultra cool condominium, but they ain't paying the faculty.
Right, exactly. I mean, that's part of what strikes me, is that there's a lot of money that goes into buildings. So where's the rest of it going?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, we're right on the hour.
Okay. Well, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. You know that. We have lots of interesting conversations.
Yeah.
So thank you for letting me be here with you.
Well, thank you. For
My pleasure.
Really, as always, we always say great, stimulating conversations.
Maybe we should just record every conversation we have.
Well, that would be an idea.
Okay, so do we say goodbye to people, or?
I'm not sure. This is where when we are actually signed off.
I think Tamara told me last time that it cuts us off no matter what, at something like 10 minutes after the hour.